In the late 1970s, if you walked into a Pontiac dealership and ordered a brand new Trans Am, you expected one thing above all else: a Pontiac engine. That's what the badge meant. That's what the legend promised. That's what generations of Pontiac enthusiasts had come to believe was sacred and non-negotiable. When you bought a Pontiac, you got Pontiac power. Period. But in 1977, something strange started happening under those long shaker hoods. Something that would send shockwaves through the muscle car community and ignite arguments that continue to this day. Customers opened the hood expecting a proud Pontiac V8 with familiar casting marks and the distinctive look they had come to recognize over years of ownership, and instead found an engine built by Oldsmobile, not Pontiac, not even close. A completely different division's engine sitting in the bay of America's most iconic muscle car. And that engine, the Oldsmobile 403, would quickly become one of the most controversial power plants ever installed in a Trans Am. Some people say it saved the car during an impossible era. Others say it nearly ruined Pontiac's hard-earned reputation forever. But what most people don't realize is that the real story is far more complicated and a lot more interesting than either side wants to admit. Because the Olds 403 wasn't just a random engine thrown into a muscle car by accountants who didn't care about heritage. It was the product of an entire industry in crisis, a desperate solution to impossible circumstances, and it almost never happened at all. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to the early 1970s and understand just how dramatically the automotive landscape changed in just a few short years. Just a few years earlier, American muscle was at its absolute peak. The horsepower wars had reached levels that seemed almost reckless in retrospect. Pontiac's legendary 455 Super Duty was crushing competitors with massive torque that could twist chassis and destroy rear axles. Chevrolet had the LS6 454, widely considered one of the greatest big blocks ever manufactured. Chrysler had the 426 Hemi, the engine that dominated drag strips and NASCAR tracks alike. Engines were enormous. Compression ratios were sky-high, often exceeding 11:1. Horsepower numbers were absolutely insane, with factory ratings sometimes deliberately underreported to avoid insurance scrutiny. It was a golden age that enthusiasts assumed would last forever. Then everything collapsed practically overnight. In 1973, the oil crisis hit America with devastating force. OPEC's oil embargo sent fuel prices skyrocketing. Gas that had cost 30 cents per gallon suddenly doubled and then kept climbing. Long lines formed at gas stations across America, with drivers waiting hours just to fill their tanks. Some stations ran completely dry. Rationing systems were implemented in certain states. Suddenly, those big, thirsty V8s that had seemed so desirable looked like expensive dinosaurs. Customers who had once bragged about their engine's displacement now worried about making it to work without running out of fuel. And then came emissions regulations. The Clean Air Act and subsequent amendments forced automakers to slash compression ratios dramatically. Leaded fuel, which high-compression engines required, began disappearing from gas stations nationwide. Catalytic converters arrived as mandatory equipment starting in 1975, strangling exhaust flow and requiring unleaded fuel that couldn't support high compression. Engines that once made 400 horsepower were suddenly struggling to produce barely 200. The muscle car era didn't fade away gradually. It was murdered by forces completely outside Detroit's control. Pontiac felt this harder than almost any other manufacturer. Their legendary 455 V8 had been one of the torque kings of the muscle car era. With a massive 4.15-inch bore and a 4.21-inch stroke, it displaced 455 cubic inches of pure American torque. In its prime, the 455 HO and Super Duty variants could produce over 300 horsepower even with net ratings, and the actual output was likely much higher. But by 1976, tightening emissions rules and mounting fuel economy pressure killed the 455 completely. It simply couldn't meet the new requirements while producing meaningful power. Pontiac needed a replacement engine for their performance lineup. Fast. But here's the problem that Pontiac engineers faced. Pontiac's smaller engines couldn't carry the Trans Am's performance image anymore. The Pontiac 400 V8, still alive in the mid-1970s, had served the division well for years. With a 4.12-inch bore and a 3.75-inch stroke, it displaced 400 cubic inches and featured the robust construction that Pontiac was known for. In the early muscle car days, this engine produced well over 350 horsepower in high-performance trim. It had powered countless GTOs, Firebirds, and Trans Ams to glory on streets and strips across America. But by 1977, with emissions control equipment hanging off every available surface, low-compression pistons designed for unleaded fuel, restrictive exhaust systems required by federal law, and air injection systems pumping fresh air into the exhaust, the mighty Pontiac 400 was down to around 180 horsepower. That was barely enough to move a 3,700-pound Trans Am with any real authority. Sure, it still sounded good. The exhaust note was still there. The shaker hood still looked aggressive. But the performance that had made the Trans Am legendary was fading fast. Pontiac engineers knew they had a serious problem on their hands. But General Motors Corporate had another problem too. They were literally running out of Pontiac engines. You see, GM wasn't just dealing with emissions regulations and fuel economy mandates. They were dealing with production chaos on a scale they had never anticipated. Every division inside General Motors, Chevrolet, Pontiac, Buick, and Oldsmobile, built their own engines in their own dedicated facilities. Each division had its own engineering teams, its own casting plants, its own assembly lines. Normally, that decentralized system worked perfectly fine, but during the late 1970s, demand for the Trans Am absolutely exploded in a way nobody at GM had predicted. Thanks to the 1977 movie Smokey and the Bandit, starring Burt Reynolds as a charismatic bootlegger outrunning the law in a black and gold Trans Am, the car suddenly became the hottest vehicle in America. The movie was a massive box office success, earning over $300 million worldwide, and every young man who walked out of that theater wanted to be the Bandit, which meant they wanted a Trans Am. Dealers couldn't keep them on the lot. Orders piled up faster than Pontiac could fill them. Waiting lists stretched for months. Some dealerships reported customers offering oversticker price just to jump the queue. Pontiac desperately wanted to build as many Trans Ams as possible to capitalize on this unprecedented demand. But their engine plants in Pontiac, Michigan simply couldn't produce enough Pontiac 400s to meet the surge. The tooling was aging. The facilities had limited capacity. Expanding production would require massive capital investment that would take years to complete. Pontiac was watching potential profits drive away to competitors every single day, and that's when GM Corporate made a decision that would ignite a firestorm of controversy. They started installing Oldsmobile engines in Pontiac Trans Ams, specifically the Oldsmobile 403. Now on paper, the 403 actually sounded pretty impressive for its era. It was essentially a big block style engine built on a small block architecture, displacing 403 cubic inches thanks to a huge 4.351-inch bore combined with a relatively short 3.385-inch stroke. That bore size was absolutely massive, one of the largest ever used in any production small block V8 from any manufacturer. The enormous bore diameter allowed Oldsmobile engineers to fit large valves in the cylinder heads, improving airflow potential. The heads themselves featured good port design for their era, flowing respectable numbers on the bench. But there was a significant trade-off hiding inside that impressive bore size. The cylinder walls between those massive bores were thin, very thin. So thin, in fact, that Oldsmobile engineers had to get creative with the block design to make it work at all. They developed a unique casting approach called windowed main webs, large open sections cut into the block casting between the cylinder banks. These windows served dual purposes. They saved weight compared to a solid casting. and they allowed the thin cylinder walls to flex slightly under thermal stress without cracking. It was clever engineering that worked perfectly well for street use and normal driving conditions. But hardcore racers and engine builders would later discover that those same features severely limited the engine's strength when pushed to extreme horsepower levels. You couldn't treat a 403 like you treated a traditional Pontiac block. Still, the 403 had solid numbers for its difficult era. Compression ratio sat around 8.011, low by muscle car standards, but necessary for emissions compliance and unleaded fuel compatibility. Horsepower in Trans Am trim was officially rated at 185 horsepower at 4,000 RPM. Torque was a respectable 320 pound-feet available at just 2,800 RPM, meaning the power came on early and stayed accessible throughout the driving range. Those numbers weren't mind-blowing by any standard. But remember, this was the late 1970s. Everything was slower. Everything was strangled. Every manufacturer was struggling. For context, the Chevrolet 350 V8 in the Corvette that same year produced only 180 horsepower, despite being installed in America's premier sports car. So on paper, the Oldsmobile 403 actually looked competitive with anything else available. But the controversy wasn't really about horsepower numbers. It was about something deeper: identity. Because Pontiac fans were absolutely furious when they discovered what was happening. They didn't buy a Trans Am to get an Oldsmobile engine under the hood. They bought a Pontiac because they wanted Pontiac power. And the backlash was immediate and intense. Customers started noticing something odd when they raised those dramatic shaker hoods for the first time. Instead of the familiar Pontiac casting marks they expected to see, there was a giant raised 5A code on the block identifying it as an Oldsmobile product. Even more obviously, the distinctive Oldsmobile oil filler tube mounted at the front of the intake manifold looked completely different from what Pontiac engines used. It was impossible to miss once you knew what to look for. Word spread quickly through enthusiast communities. Magazine writers noticed the switch and began questioning Pontiac's commitment to performance heritage. Car enthusiasts at shows and meets noticed and started inspecting Trans Am engine bays with suspicious eyes. And suddenly the question everyone was asking at every Pontiac gathering was painfully simple. Was a Trans Am still a real Pontiac if it didn't actually have a Pontiac engine? But GM Corporate didn't seem to care about the philosophical debate. They had sales records to chase and shareholders to satisfy. And the sales numbers were absolutely staggering. In 1977, Pontiac sold over 68,000 Trans Ams despite the engine controversy. By 1978, that number climbed even higher as Smokey and the Bandit mania continued sweeping the nation. And in 1979, Trans Am sales absolutely exploded to more than 117,000 units. It became the single best-selling year in the entire history of the Trans Am nameplate. And a huge percentage of those cars, the majority in most markets, had the Oldsmobile 403 sitting under the hood instead of a Pontiac engine. But there was another twist that made the situation even more confusing. Not all Trans Ams got the 403. Cars sold in California and certain high-altitude states still received the Pontiac 400. Why the difference? Emissions regulations. The Oldsmobile 403 couldn't meet California's stricter emissions standards no matter how much equipment was hung on it. So Pontiac's own engine remained available there a little longer simply because it could be certified where the Oldsmobile couldn't, which created an even stranger and more frustrating situation for buyers. Two identical Trans Ams could roll off the Norwood, Ohio assembly line on the exact same day, both with the same paint code, both with the same options, both with the same window sticker, one with a Pontiac engine, one with an Oldsmobile engine, and buyers in most states had absolutely no idea which one they were getting until they opened the hood. It depended entirely on which engine was available on the assembly line when their car came through. Imagine ordering your dream muscle car, waiting months for delivery, and discovering it had someone else's engine installed. For purists and longtime Pontiac loyalists, it felt like an absolute betrayal of everything the brand represented. But here's the part most people miss when they tell this story. The Oldsmobile 403 wasn't actually a bad engine. In fact, in some important ways, it was better suited for the realities of late 1970s driving than Pontiac's own 400. Its shorter 3.385-inch stroke meant the engine revved noticeably smoother with less internal vibration at highway speeds. The large bore diameter allowed better cylinder head breathing at higher RPM, giving the engine a willingness to rev that some Pontiac engines lacked. And the torque curve was incredibly usable for real-world street driving, with strong low-end pull that made the cars feel responsive in daily use. Car magazines of the era actually recorded respectable performance numbers. Quarter-mile times around 16.0 seconds flat at roughly 85 nm were documented for a 1979 Trans Am equipped with the 403 and automatic transmission. Not blistering by 1960s muscle car standards, certainly, but absolutely respectable for the emissions-choked late 1970s when most performance cars struggled to break into the 17-second range. The 403 Trans Am could still embarrass most of its competition when the light turned green. Still, there was a problem that enthusiasts quickly discovered. Hot rodders found the 403 had hard limits. Because those thin cylinder walls and windowed main webs that worked fine for street driving didn't like massive horsepower. Push the engine beyond about 450 horsepower with boost or nitrous or aggressive modifications, and things started breaking in expensive ways. Main caps would walk and shift under load, destroying bearing surfaces. Cylinder walls would flex excessively under combustion pressure, killing ring seal. Blocks would crack under extreme stress that Pontiac blocks handled without complaint. Pontiac's older 400 block, by comparison, had thick cylinder walls and beefy main webs that could handle serious racing abuse without modification. Drag racers had been building 600 horsepower Pontiac blocks for years without special reinforcement. The 403 couldn't match that strength no matter how carefully it was built. That fundamental difference fueled the debate even more intensely. Was GM sacrificing long-term strength and performance potential for short-term production convenience? And the controversy grew louder with every engine failure at the strip. But then, something unexpected happened over the following years. The Oldsmobile 403 started gaining its own following among enthusiasts who actually worked with the engines. Experienced mechanics realized the engine responded surprisingly well to mild performance upgrades. Better camshafts with more aggressive profiles and improved valve timing events woke the engine up noticeably. Improved intake manifolds replaced the restrictive factory units and allowed the engine to breathe properly. Headers to replace the terrible factory exhaust manifolds freed up trapped horsepower that the catalytic converters and crimped pipes had been strangling. With those relatively simple and affordable modifications, horsepower could jump from the factory 185 rating to around 280 or even 300. Suddenly, the engine felt genuinely alive. The Trans Am transformed from adequate transportation into something that felt like a real muscle car again. Drag racers began experimenting with the platform too, despite its limitations. Some builders even reinforced the blocks with aftermarket main-bearing girdles and installed stronger forged rotating assemblies to push the limits higher. With enough preparation, 500 horsepower 403 builds became possible, though they required far more work than equivalent Pontiac engine builds. But the real turning point in the 403's story came in 1979. That year, Pontiac introduced something special to celebrate a milestone: the 10th anniversary Trans Am. Silver paint that gleamed like liquid metal under showroom lights, mirrored T-tops that reflected the sky, dramatic silver leather interior, special badging and anniversary documentation. It became one of the most iconic and recognizable designs in muscle car history almost immediately. Magazines featured it on covers, posters hung on bedroom walls across America. The car looked like nothing else on the road. And guess what engine powered most of them? The Oldsmobile 403. More than 5,600 of those special anniversary cars left the factory with that controversial Oldsmobile engine under their beautiful hoods. Only a small percentage received Pontiac 400 engines, and those went primarily to California buyers, which meant one of Pontiac's most collectible and valuable Trans Ams ever built relied on Oldsmobile power for the overwhelming majority of production. And the debate has never really stopped. Some collectors today absolutely insist that a real Trans Am must have a Pontiac engine to be considered authentic. They view the Oldsmobile-powered cars as somehow lesser, incomplete, not true to the heritage. Others argue passionately that the Olds 403 is simply part of the car's history, and more importantly, the only reason Pontiac could keep up with unprecedented demand during the late 70s boom. Without that engine, they argue, Pontiac would have lost thousands of potential customers to competitors. Both sides have valid points. Neither side is likely to ever convince the other. But the story doesn't end with that debate, because by 1980, everything changed yet again. The Pontiac 400 was finally discontinued entirely after years of declining production. Emissions rules tightened even further under new federal mandates. And the Oldsmobile 403 followed its Pontiac counterpart into retirement after the 1979 model year. It simply couldn't meet the incoming requirements either. In their place came smaller, more efficient engines. Turbocharged V6 engines that used technology instead of displacement. Computer-controlled fuel injection systems that replaced carburetors. Smaller displacement V8s with sophisticated electronics managing every aspect of operation. The era of big carbureted V8 muscle cars was officially over. Production of the Oldsmobile 403 ended after roughly 750,000 units were manufactured across several GM models over its production run. And just like that, the most controversial engine ever placed in a Trans Am disappeared from assembly lines forever. But its legacy stuck around and continues to generate discussion decades later. Today, enthusiasts still argue about the 403 at car shows, in online forums, and at cruise nights across America. Open the hood of any late 1970s Trans Am at a show, and people will inevitably lean in to check one specific detail before anything else. Is it Pontiac or Oldsmobile? And that simple question reveals a much bigger story. A story about an industry under unprecedented pressure from forces beyond its control. About emissions laws that strangled performance overnight. About fuel crises that changed consumer priorities in ways nobody predicted. About corporate decisions made in desperation that violated decades of brand tradition. About how one engine from a completely different division ended up powering America's most famous muscle car during its most successful sales years. In the end, the Oldsmobile 403 didn't actually destroy the Trans Am. It helped keep the nameplate alive during one of the darkest and most difficult eras in muscle car history. Without it, Pontiac almost certainly couldn't have built enough Trans Ams to satisfy the explosive demand following Smokey and the Bandit. Customers would have walked away to competitors who could deliver cars, and the legend of the screaming chicken on that iconic hood might have faded much sooner than it eventually did. So yes, the Oldsmobile 403 was controversial. It violated expectations that Pontiac fans held sacred. It lacked the racing strength that hardcore enthusiasts demanded. It created confusion and resentment that persists to this day. But it was also absolutely necessary given the circumstances. A strange solution to a strange and difficult moment in automotive history. And sometimes, the most controversial machines end up being the ones that save the story from ending too soon. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most debated engines in muscle car history, let me know in the comments what engine or rivalry you want to explore next. And make sure to subscribe, because the next story might be even crazier than this one.